Okay, let's talk about Ultra Heaven in relation to Japanese history, the social commentary that it's making, focusing on the Showa era, which is pre 90s. So let's start with the bottom line. Ultra Heaven explores Japan's repressed national trauma of its failed idealism, as well as the decadence or social decay of Japan's capitalist society. And I know that might sound a little scary and, complicated, but it's just history. So if you know the history, it's not going to be that hard to understand. But before we can look into the Showa era, we have to cover 1990s Japan, often called the lost decade. It was a horrible time for the country, mainly due to three major incidents. First was the collapse of the 80s bubble economy in the early 90s. Japan went from extremely wealthy to being very poor. People were broke and the job market was horrible. You have a lot of worker exploitation with temp workers, a lot of people working dead end jobs, freeders, and a lot of unemployment, needs, hikikomori, stuff like that. This is who Kabu is. He represents the loser adults in the 90s. Part of him, at least. Then we have the twin disasters of 1995. First, the Kobe earthquake, one of the biggest natural disasters in Japan's history. 5,000 people killed, 40,000 injured, and 300,000 homeless. It made people lose trust in the government because, they were a little overconfident with the infrastructure. They thought they didn't need to recheck the old buildings and stuff like that. This isn't really depicted in the manga, but it is an important incident. Then, third, the second disaster of 1995 was the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway, a terrorist attack where deadly sarin gas was released in the trains at rush hour, killing 13 people and injuring thousands. The attack was done by the doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo, who rejected society and believed the world would end in an apocalypse. Of course, the meditation center is a clear reference to these guys, which is the topic of next video, not this one. So, these three incidents were a shock to most people in Japan because it seemingly came out of nowhere. The national story or grand narrative of Japan was of a war-torn country rising from the ashes to become this economic powerhouse. But somehow it all collapsed in the 90s, economically, socially, and spiritually. There was a dissonance in the national story, something wrong. And Ultra Heaven, at least the part of it, addresses this shock by pointing out that there were events leading up to the lost decade, to the 90s. It wasn't just some anomaly, it came from within the nation. They were, in fact, a product of the nation's traumatic past. See, the high growth economy of the 60s to the 80s was preceded by the post war era. At this time, obviously, World War II devastated the country. Japan was poor, and they were occupied by the US. And it was not a peaceful occupation, it was rough. But by adopting democratic policies, the US helping them in a forceful way, very forceful way, and, Japanese ingenuity, they were back to being a superpower, an industrialized nation. In 1956, the White Paper on the Economy of Japan declared that Japan's post-war era was over. And now came the high-growth economy, Kodo Seicho Keizai, where Japan marched towards modernity and the first world. The income doubling plan in 1960 worked. Japan's GDP grew 10% a year, and there were landmark events that marked this growth, such as the Tokyo Olympics in '64 and the World Expo in 1970, which showed Japan's soft power through their technological progress. There was big hope for the future. However, things weren't all good because in the late 50s to the 60s, there was significant opposition towards Japan's capitalist US-based policies. There were the Anpo Protests, which opposed the US-Japan Security Treaty of 1960, called Anpo, which allowed the US to build military bases in Japan. This made it seem like the country was still under the US's rule and that they were a part of the US bloc during the Cold War. Unsurprisingly, a lot of people did not like that because they were just bombed and occupied by the US. This was made worse when Prime Minister Kishi, who was backed by the CIA, forcibly passed a bill that increased police authority to help the Anpo succeed. So, with the leadership of the Japanese left and the student movement of Japan's universities, the protests against the Anpo were held, lasting for about a year, involving 92.5 million people, a third of Japan's population. But the treaty still continued. It didn't change anything besides the prime minister resigning and Eisenhower, US president, canceling his visit to Japan. This created disillusionment. All that struggle didn't lead to much change, if any. So, a good amount of people stopped their political activism. But of course, some of them still continued, leading to the creation of Japan's new left, which was more radical because the somewhat peaceful methods of the old left didn't work. So they did a lot of protests and activist stuff, which were much more radical. This peaked in the 68-69 student protests that were against Japan's capitalist economic and political system, Japan helping the US in the Vietnam War without the consent of the people, and a lot of complaints coming from the effects of high economic growth. See, Japan was mostly a rural country before the whole, US occupation. But then industrialization happened, people started moving into cities, they were densely packed together, became a cog in a machine, more free time, dehumanization, the usual existential issues coming from living in a capitalist society. Which is why the student movements were mostly Marxist left idealists. Also, this was a different generation of students than the first Anpo 8 years ago in 1960, as they did not live through the war. So, a big part of their struggle was internal, having to do with the general malaise of life, existential issues. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, the protests didn't change anything, again, other than the government passing a law that gave police greater authority on campuses, causing the student movement to die down. So when there was also the renewal of the Anpo in 1970, 10 years after the first one, there were protests again, but they were just ignored because they were peaceful. Yeah, most people became apathetic towards activism because the high economic growth made life more comfortable. Activism seemed unnecessary. So it's kind of the same as 10 years before, where people felt hopeless, but it's much worse because Japan is much better now, economically. So the only ones left were the more radical groups, which merged into the Red Army faction that armed themselves to counter the police force. The faction was divided into parts. Some members fled overseas by hijacking a plane, and the ones that stayed in Japan formed the United Red Army, URA, carrying out a number of terrorist attacks. This culminated in 1972, when 5 members of the URA barricaded themselves in a lodge in Mount Asama with a hostage after being chased by the police. They held off 3,000 policemen in a 10-day siege that was broadcasted live on NHK to 60 million people, reaching a ratings peak of 87% of the national TV audience. At first, the public sympathized with the radicals as the spirit of the idealist 60s remains. But support died off when an internal purge within the URA was revealed, as several members' bodies were found buried in the URA's training grounds. They killed each other because some of them weren't committed enough to the cause. And, that's kind of oversimplifying things, but yeah. The extreme violence alienated the public. As a result, the Japanese left and all the movements heavily declined. And it seemed like Japan had overcome its radical period into the unprecedented prosperity of the 70s, where capitalism is in full blast. Until the 90s happened, of course. But enough history, let's go back to Ultra Heaven Volume 1, where we see allusions or references to the failed Anpo protests and the national traumas of Japan. The manga starts off with the space commercial, invoking the tech, innovation, and capitalism of the high-growth economy. Then we transition to Kabu in his dirty apartment, reflecting on his messed-up life. He says, "When I opened my eyes, it was already dark." He missed out on the wealthy 80s, now it's the 90s, and it's dark. But the world of Ultra Heaven doesn't seem to be struggling like 90s Japan. The few city panels that we get are normal, maybe even wealthy. So, from its appearance, the manga emulates the wealth of the 80s, but within that wealth, there is a decadent society, a sickness that is a mix of social and spiritual issues in the 90s and even the 80s. It's a hidden dystopia. Next, we go to the Pump Bar Nova with middle-aged salarymen who are probably in their prime during the 70s and 80s. Pumps here are basically alcohol. You know, salarymen drinking after work. Then Kabu walks in, and they look down on him. As I said before, Kabu is a failed 90s adult, a freeder, unemployed drug dealer. And then Kabu goes on a monologue about a show he watched as a kid about a hero saving everyone. Ultraman, of course. He was so excited to watch it that he fell asleep, and when he woke up, it was already over. Kabu was a 60s kid. He experienced the hope of the 60s that was prevalent in media, art, and of course, the activism during that time. However, he was too young to join the activism of the 60s, and he missed out on the wealth of the 70s and 80s since he was in foster care. He was a poor kid. According to sociologist Osawa Masachi, 1945 to 1970 was the age of idealism, where people believed that they could make their ideals come true in reality. And I think that's why Ultraman was picked, because it's the most popular, hopeful show at that time. You believe you can beat the monsters, you believe you can beat authority, you believe that you can change the world just like the humans in Ultraman. But of course, nothing changed. The idealism failed as Kabu failed to overdose in the bar, which is why he mentions the pumpers demonstration, which is, the student protests. Then the mass celebration on the night preceding the amendment of the Pharmaceutical Affairs Law, legalizing drugs. Call me crazy, but I think this might be the security treaty with the US, the Anpo, especially the second one in 1970. It symbolizes a massive push towards capitalism. And in Ultra Heaven, they were celebrating the Anpo instead of protesting it like in reality. So I think drugs might be an analog to capitalism. So they were celebrating capitalism finally going full blast when the second Anpo happened in 1970. Remember the roller coaster party in Volume 2? They weren't just celebrating drugs getting legalized, they were celebrating the wealth of the country. As Kabu's mom says, we are going to heaven, a place where everything is possible. It seemed like anything was possible in the high-growth economy, as if the ideals of the past were fulfilled. But of course, it was fake and Kabu's mom dies. But we'll get to that later. Lastly, in the bar scene, I want to point out the names of the pumps, Pegila and Gamora. Those are kaijus from Ultraman. Both Kabu and the salarymen look to the 60s for relief. Kabu relives his childhood, while the salarymen relive their activism and idealism. After the bar, we also see Mr. Walleye being abused by the cops, reminiscent of the increasing police authority and oppression that stopped the student movement, as well as in the first Anpo. Then skipping ahead to Kabu's drug trip, he gets laughed at by people as his hand is stuck in the wall. Then he gets abused by two cops, they shoot him, he doesn't die, he releases snowflakes, the crowd is amazed by the snowflakes, Kabu shoots back, killing the cops, and now the crowd is scared. Call me crazy, but I think this is the URA hostage standoff incident in the lodge. At first, the public didn't take URA seriously, maybe even hating them because of the terrorism. Kabu gets laughed at. But when the standoff happened, they were sympathetic. 5 people in the lodge, 3,000 policemen. It was like a spectacular underdog story. They liked the snowflakes. But then, when it was revealed that there was a violent internal purge and, the violence in the standoff itself, people were horrified. They stopped supporting them. They were scared of Kabu. I mean, it fits. And you know what's crazy? In the final arrest of the radicals in the standoff, exactly 2 cops were killed in action. Just like Kabu killing 2 cops. Not to mention the symbolism of Kabu turning into a monster. They went from activists to terrorists. So in all of this, Ultra Heaven portrays that loss of idealism of the 60s and the capitalist 70s and 80s. Next, the manga tries to reconcile or understand Japan's repressed trauma of its failed activism. Because after the Japanese left and the Red Army failed, the incident wasn't processed well by society. Official accounts of the standoff incident and the Red Army were minimal or stereotypical. The Red Army was seen as an other, an extreme group of radicals detached from normal society. They saw them as monsters. As a result, the radical groups and the student movement's concerns and demands were ignored. The social issues of the 60s were never addressed properly by Japan. The whole incident was swept under the rug and Japan moved on to enjoy its wealth, full steam ahead to capitalism. This is represented by Kabu being hunted down and shot by the hygiene agents every time he has a flashback, representing Japanese authorities forcing people to forget the nation's past. And when trauma isn't addressed, it's gonna show up again and again. It will continue to haunt the present, affecting everything that we do. This parallels Kabu's trauma of his mother, because Kabu's mom represents Showa-era Japan in its totality, the good and the bad. She's symbolized by the Napolitan spaghetti, an iconic Showa-era post-war dish that evokes nostalgia. Natsukashi. It's a spaghetti recipe that uses ketchup instead of tomato sauce because it's cheaper, since post-war Japan was poor. This represents the idealized image of post-war Japan, a beautiful struggle to create something greater, the true soul and spirit of the era, which is why Kabu associates his mother's best, warmest moment when she's being herself with her cooking the Napolitan. But she was also part of the movement of legalizing drugs, shown to be very hopeful of the future when she says, "We're going to heaven, anything is possible." This represents the idealism of the student movements and Japan's economic growth, right? The hope of the 60s. But then his mom got too deep into the drugs and she died in an overdose. I think this represents Japan's complete surrender into capitalism and the death of activism and the true spirit of Japan. I think it also represents the fake, temporary success of the high-growth economy. Her joy of partying on the roller coaster wasn't real. It was built on the authorities suppressing the idealism of the 60s and increasing government authority. We even get a scene where the guys explain that the hygiene department is the hospital and the police brought together. Government authority had become stronger and ended the activism. Then we get Kabu as a child looking over his mom's dead body. At first, he doesn't accept her death, like Japan repressing the trauma of its failed idealism. After that, Kabu passes out and we go to the spaghetti cooking scene, where Kabu rediscovers her mother's true nature, representing the rediscovery of activism, idealism, and the true spirit of Japan, which leads to Kabu accepting his mother's death, accepting or at least acknowledging the trauma of the 60s. And that's the solution Ultra Heaven offers, that by revisiting the trauma, we can move forward and become better. Next, in Volume 3, we take another look into Kabu's trauma and his identity crisis. But first, let's go back to sociologist Osawa Masachi. If the 60s was the age of idealism, where ideals could become true in reality, the 70s and 80s were the fictional age, where people turned to fictional worlds to fulfill their ideals because it failed in reality. Then, the 90s was the age of impossibility, where the ideals of the fictional age appear meaningless in the face of the overwhelming power of the real. You know, the economic collapse, the Kobe earthquake, and the Alm attacks made people feel hopeless, and their fictionalized ideals were abandoned. Basically, things got too real, and the escapism from, diving into fiction was abandoned, right? This is relevant to Kabu's and ultimately Japan's identity crisis, specifically the 4 ideas of heaven that I talked about in the explanation video, if you remember. First is Kabu's idea of heaven, a drug-filled society where reality doesn't matter. This represents the hopeless 90s, the age of impossibility. The ideal is now completely dead. Just taking drugs for fun isn't enough to escape reality. So Kabu chooses pure escapism, taking drugs until his death, completely leaving behind reality like the hikikomoris of the 90s. And again, spaghetti wraps them up because they're wrapped up by the trauma of the 60s, the student protests and whatever. Second is his mother's idea of heaven, a degenerate drug paradise where anything is possible. This is the fictional age of the 80s. The economy was strong and things seemed to be good on the surface. Kabu's mom and everyone on the roller coaster lost themselves to drugs, to capitalism. But it wasn't all bad. They still had some hope, realizing their ideals in fiction, in the drug movement. That's why she says we're going to heaven. Anything is possible. It's not completely hopeless like Kabu. And I would also say that people in the meditation center and Sally represent that fictionalized ideal, realizing them through the amplifier and the drone, separate from reality. Third idea of heaven is Kabu as Ultraman fighting the spaghetti monster. He wants to kill the memory of his mother to cope with his trauma. Remember? This would be Japan repressing its trauma of the student protests, the Red Army incidents, reducing the idealism of the 60s to an evil, radical, extremist movement, shown by Kabu villainizing his Napolitan spaghetti mother. His mom is the 60s, right? Finally, the fourth idea of heaven, where Kabu remembers the love of his mother, her true identity. By recognizing and understanding what truly happened in the past, you can come to terms with your trauma and reintegrate that trauma back into yourself, accepting it as part of your identity. Thus, Ultra Heaven argues that by revisiting the past and seeing it as what it is, Kabu, as well as Japan, can come to terms with their trauma and their identity crisis. That's why the symbol of a wormhole is used. A crack in space and time that connects 2 points together, the past and the present. Only by making sure of our own sickness, of our own trauma, diving into the wormhole, acknowledging the past, can we reach the land of light. Unless the living God is there to seal away the hole. Now, what does he represent? I don't know. Maybe the powers that be that stop us, maybe the nature of the world that we can never realize our ideals in reality. I don't know. I guess we have to wait for Volume 4 for that. And one final note, Sally serves a similar purpose to Kabu's mom. She also represents the 60s, with her being a reference to Sally the Witch, a similarly hopeful anime and manga like Ultraman. And whereas Kabu's mom represents the true spirit of post-war Japan with the spaghetti, Sally represents the true spirit of the spiritual New Age movement with her obsession with amps and whatnot. Both of them save Kabu and Japan from their traumas, because the whole spirituality religion thing is also a big trauma from the attacks in the 90s, which will be the topic of next video. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Trauma, diving to the past, and, reconciling and becoming a better version of yourself. That's pretty much it. I'm sorry if this video does feel a little unfocused because, to be honest, I don't want to spend too much time talking about it and going into detail, because this is kind of a tough topic for me, because I'm not a scholar. I'm just a random guy on the internet. So yeah. Thanks for watching, guys, and see ya.